Hey, Mohammed.
Hi, good
Hey,
evening.
man. How's it going?
Yeah, good. Finally in.
Yeah, same. Took a minute.
Yeah.
All right, so let me start sharing the screen and then maybe we can do some updates. So I've been quite busy with Elsa 3 past week, which was really good. There was this team from a customer that are going to adopt Elsa 3, but wanted to tackle some issues with the designer, some missing functionalities. So we were able to do a lot. So that was pretty awesome.
Cool.
So I thought maybe it's nice to go over some of these items. So I created a little list of updates. I can talk you through it. Of course, if you have any topics or questions, we can add them to the agenda as well. So while you guys think on that, I will start from the top all the way to the bottom. The store API, that's actually something I wanted to talk about last week, but didn't have the time. So I'll do it now. For that, we will try to open the backend. So basically what this is about is just the refactoring in the persistence APIs of Elsa. As you know, we're using abstractions. So at the very core, there are interfaces like iWorkflow definition store, iWorkflow instance store, execution log store as this one that's selected. And that basically simplified the API where you only have methods like save and find many, as opposed to having specialized functions like find many by definition ID or find many by correlation ID and definition ID. So there were all sorts of, not arbitrary, but it seemed arbitrary because I would add functions based on a given use case. So it made the interface a little bit clunky in my eyes. So I simplified it by employing a model that's similar to the specification pattern, but not the way it was done in Elsa 2, where it was too open-ended and too flexible, which made it really hard for implementers to realize what are the various permutations, what are the actual specifications out there to implement. So that made it very tricky to implement custom persistent stores. So here I took sort of a middle ground, I guess, where, for example, taking the workflow instance store, that's not this one. Well, this is not a good example. Let me open a different one. So let's take a look at the workflow instance store in the management module. So it has just basically 1, 2, well, 3, 4 sets of methods, and let's take a look at the find async. As you can see, what they all have in common are they just accept a filter, which is basically your specification. And actually, let's take a look at the filter, the workflow instance filter. The specification is, this filter is used as a bunch of fields that if they are set, they will be included in the query. And if not, they will not be considered. So for example, if you wanted to get all workflow instances of a given status, you would just set the workflow status. Or maybe you're interested in a single workflow instance, then you just set the ID, or maybe you want multiple, then you set a collection of IDs. This one also supports a search term. So it's very tailored towards this given persistent store, but the API is very clean. So the caller would just instantiate a workflow definition filter, fill out the fields that they want to filter by, and that's it. It's a little bit inspired also on the Mongo API, where you also can construct, which is more advanced, of course, more dynamic, this one, but the usage is nice, where you just have an object that you configure and then fire away the request. Here are the variants for getting single items and multiple items, multiple matches. And there are some overloads. For example, if you wanted to order by a given property on the workflow definition, then you would use this overload where you get to specify the order. So the same refactoring has been applied to all of the other stores, so including the workflow definition store, workflow instance store. We saw the other one here somewhere in the runtime. There you go. So we have bookmark store, trigger store, and the workflow execution log store, and the workflow state store. And some of them are simpler. They don't need all of the other methods yet, but we might add it. But the idea is to keep it a little bit consistent.
Quick question. What is the advantage of creating a specific class filter regarding, for example, directly passing an expression, a func expression like it does in the Azure Table SDK or Azure Blob SDK, for example?
Yeah, good question. So we could do it. But then it depends on the underlying persistence mechanisms in API, if it can actually translate that expression into something meaningful for the underlying persistence store. And for Entity Framework Core, it would work out. Maybe also for Lucene, I don't know, but maybe that will work out too. Probably also for MongoDB, or most certainly it should work out for that. But what if you have a very specific or specialized persistence store, maybe in the form of a web API that you implemented, and you want to use your API to read and write data. In that case, it would be probably very hard to translate these expressions to API calls or parameters you want to send to your API. So that's pretty much the only reason. So as not to rely on expressions being able to be translated. If we let go of that requirement, then we could expose it, and that would simplify it from this point of view, from the implementation point of view or the API point of view. But it limits that scenario. And I know at least one user who uses this in their application.
Okay, so the idea is just to be able to read the field specific class and get some information to be able to rewrite some specific implementation regarding the provider we use. That's right?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
And actually I can show the difference between an EF Core implementation and a Lucene or Elasticsearch implementation. So let's take a look at...
The Elasticsearch is used for the log only, or for all the store?
There's only an implementation for workflow instance store and workflow execution log store, but it could also be used for other stores if we wanted to. But I don't think at this point, at least, that it doesn't add much value. But maybe that will change in the future. See contracts. So here we have the workflow execution log store, and if we look at its implementations, we have EF Core, Elastic Workflow Store, and memory implementation. So the EF Core memory, they're very similar because, let's see, here we have find. Then here it calls a method called filter, which is private here. And basically what it does, it takes the filter and calls an apply on the filter, which is just a method on the filter itself, which translates it applies its properties onto the queryable that's being received here using simple logic. So if some field is not null, then it will update the queryable by some appropriate condition. But that's the pattern here. And to get back to your point, if we were to allow just expressions directly, then we wouldn't even need this separate object. But let's look at the other implementation, Elastic. It has a similar approach here. It also has a filter, but then of course how the filter is applied here is different. So here you're familiar, of course, with the Elasticsearch SDK. So here it uses match field. If there were a translation between expressions and Elasticsearch queries, then that would simplify things. But at the same time, I think this is a good proof of concept that it doesn't matter what the actual underlying persistence is. At this API service level, you just provide your filter object, and the implementation takes care of creating the correct query.
Yeah, okay, understand. Thanks.
All right. So there's a new activity called flow HTTP request, which is like the HTTP request activity. And just to remind you what that looks like, let me start the designer and the backend. All right, so let's say we have HTTP request. This one was there before. We have a new one. Let me explain the reason for this one. So first we add HTTP request. Let's say we want to make a request to get a single user from our backend. So for example, this URL, and then that's it. Of course, we want to capture the output, so we can get the HTTP response stored in a variable so that we could test what the status code is. Maybe if it's 200, we want to go left, and if it's 400, we want to do something else. So that would look like this. We would create a HTTP response variable, and then this the response being stored in this variable, we could now add a if or maybe a flow decision, and here we could say return get HTTP response dot status code. Let's say if it's 200, then we return true, but otherwise we return false. So we could just do it like this. If it's 200, it's true. Otherwise, it's false. Of course, we could also go with a flow switch, and then we can handle multiple status codes if we wanted to. But just let's imagine this is what we want to do. So this works. This is fine, but we can do it better using the flow HTTP request, which inherits from HTTP request, or actually both these activities, they share a common base class, but this one allows you to provide expected status codes. And if you were paying attention, you notice the same field here, but it's not fully implemented yet on this activity. But let's stick with this one for now. The way this works is here we can, like in Elsa 2, we can provide the expected status codes that we want to handle. So let's say 200 and 400. And as you can see on the outputs immediately, we get the expected status codes available as outcomes so that we can get rid of the decision here or the switch, whatever we wanted to use. So this is like a built-in switch. So that's new, which makes it a little bit easier to model your flow. So that's.
So what is the reason to have it as a separate activity rather than implementing this in the current HTTP request?
Good question. So, and that also takes me back to the reason we see it here, but when I mentioned it's not implemented, the difference is similar to when we have the flow decision here, where we have the true and false outcomes as ports, as these ports here, but we also have if. So if and flow decision, they're functionally the same, but in terms of modeling, they're different. So this one here also allows you to set a condition. It could be the same condition here. Let's say it's like this. And here what we can do is do something if this is true and if something is false, and then continue on with the rest of the flow. So we could maybe just continue with this one here. And that is not possible with this flow decision. Here you have either true and false, and that's it. So it's this direction or this direction. In here you have some embedded logic you can implement and then continue on with the main flow. Similarly, with the HTTP request activity, you can do that as well. So here you could have expected status codes like 200, 400. So now there's an error why this is why you are seeing this issue here, but let's pretend there's no issue. What would happen is you would see, similar to what you see with if, you would see 200 and 400. So you can then execute some subflow in response to some status code and then continue on with the main flow. So this flowchart model here that we are using, it's like a hybrid between flowcharts and sequential workflows.
Okay, so the original HTTP activity will act more like an if you define status codes, and the flow HTTP request will be like a normal HTTP request followed by a flow decision.
Yeah, so exactly, and this is designed for use in flowchart diagrams. But you can imagine if we have a sequential diagram editor, similar to what we have in Windows Workflow Foundation, you would probably use this one here that's now hidden from view, because in those diagrams the ports here, they don't make sense, and these ports here, they're used as connection points, so you can create connections between these ports, and that makes sense in a flowchart but doesn't make sense in a sequential diagram.
Do you have any information on this behavior on the activity? Is there any place where we have some documentation for an activity? Implementation documentation, not the description of why the developer used this activity in this workflow.
Sorry, referring to just a documentation per activity that explains when to use it, why. Yeah, so I'm thinking maybe we can add it in this documentation here, where we add a section called activities or activity library here, categorized, so we can list all of the primitives ones, the flow ones, or depending on how we want to categorize, there would be an HTTP category, and that would then display at least those two activities with a description and use cases, etc.
Do you think it could be useful to because this information will be sourced on the activity class or activity development, to be able to generate documentation directly? And do you think it could be interesting to have this kind of information directly when we create the workflow?
Yeah, 100%.
Like in a tooltip or anything like that?
Sorry, like what?
Like a tooltip?
Oh, like a tooltip. Yeah, exactly. So here we see
brief
descriptions, right? There's just a visual glitch where it doesn't overflow here, but so these give you a brief description. But I also like the idea of integrated documentation, especially with a tool like this, where maybe some hyperlink or some button that you can click that takes you to the documentation. And this documentation, of course, is written manually, but it would also be good to have XML or generated documentation based on XML so that you have more details on the specifics. And this is more like a guide.
Yeah.
But it's a good point, because it's important as a newcomer and you see these variants. It can be very confusing when to use what without proper guidance and documentation.
Sure.
Yeah, and of course, some users may have a preference. Maybe the majority of users will just be dealing with sequential, or not sequential, but flowchart diagrams when using the designer, and they may not ever want to even see the sequential ones and always use these things, and that will be configurable from the application first, and in the future that would be configuration driven, and then you can also assign it to potentially to user permissions and roles. But those are roadmap items. All right. So that's the new flow HTTP request. Improved JSON handling for HTTP workflows. So as we found when doing typical scenarios, for example, where you expose an HTTP endpoint on your workflow, receive some JSON payload, and maybe you just want to access some fields on it or echo back the JSON object to the response. That didn't work very fluidly, but that's a lot of improvement has to be made there. So just to show you is a simple example. Let's say we have an HTTP endpoint here, and we make, let's say we just want to echo back what we received. So here we do demo post, and let's say we submit this payload via Postman. So this will be the structure that we post. So we have to remember that it starts with the data and it has a support field, and data represents a user, it seems. So there's a couple of things, or more than a couple of things, we can capture from the inbound request. The raw HTTP request can be captured here using the result of type HTTP request, which is an actual C# object. Although, I think this is actually a non-serializable request that you get from .NET, but let me double check to make sure I'm not saying anything that's not true here. Right, so this HTTP request lives in the Microsoft ASP.NET Core HTTP namespace. And important here is that this is non-serializable. So when you are going to capture this one through a variable, it's important to set the storage to memory, because otherwise the system is going to try and serialize it, and that it will likely fail in this case. On this topic, thinking of making this a little bit more intelligent, where it already knows based on the type whether it's serializable or not, and use the correct storage automatically, or at least a supported store like memory. Of course, you still want to have control. Maybe you have a blob storage provider and others, so you can always override it, but maybe by default this will be unselected and not default to workflow, and then this intelligent decision making could kick in. But for now, just this little heads up. This little bug we still need to fix, where it doesn't rebind when we change the variables, but it's on the list. And to work around that, just click away and then focus again, and then it should be there, like so. But for this demo, I just will take the parse content directly. So this HTTP endpoint will also parse the inbound request body into the target type of whatever variable you have selected. So if you have a variable of type string, it will not do any parsing. It will just read the request body and store it as a string. But if you specify either a .NET type or an expandable object or just object, it will try and parse the string content into a JSON object. Or in the case of a .NET type, it will deserialize it into that type. So here, since we don't have any .NET type, we'll just use an expandable object. We could also choose to go with object, and internally by default it will deserialize into an expandable object. You could also choose to use a JSON object, which lives in the system text JSON namespace, if you wanted to use that API to then traverse your JSON object. So it's up to you, but this one is usually the most convenient, because then you can use dot notation to access fields on your incoming JSON payload. So let's call this user payload, and then we just want to write it back, just the whole object. So we should be able to say get user payload. We don't have to set a content type. If we can, but if we don't, it will default to application JSON if the content is complex object. And if it's a string, then it will default to plain text. And of course, you can explicitly control the content type that you want to use. If the content type you want to use doesn't exist in this list, you can always switch to JavaScript or Liquid and just enter the content type you want. And of course, we'll make this configurable at some point. Yeah, if you want to provide some response headers, that works too. All you need to do is just return a JavaScript object where the field names are the keys and the values are the values. So for example, like this, and this will be parsed into a dictionary and be copied into the response stream. Okay, so this, let's try this one out. If we send this one, base address, workflows, demo. Of course, I should not forget to set this one as can start workflow. Checking this box on a activity that supports triggers will create a trigger in the system so that you can actually invoke this one. So as you can see, we send this data and we received it back as is. We could also choose to just return these fields. So that would look like this. So we could say .data, because this is an expandable object with dynamic access to its fields. Publish this and then try it again. We just get that section. And this works for individual fields as well, of course. And even constructing custom objects, that works as well. So you could just say user like this. So this makes it very easy and convenient to quickly implement API endpoints using workflows if you wanted to. Another common use case is to actually make a call to some backend system. Let's imagine this API is our backend. So in response to the HTTP endpoint activity, we will send an HTTP request like this, and then the method is get. Content type will be selected automatically based on the response content type, and the output. We already created a variable called user payload, which, well, it's a dynamic object, so we can use it here. We'll ignore this payload here. We can actually just unset it. We're not going to do anything here. Keep this as is, that's fine. But here, when we send the HTTP request to this backend, this mock API, we want to store it in the user payload here. Here too, we can capture the HTTP response if we wanted to, which allows you to access more objects that are part of the HTTP response object, such as cookies and headers. But here we're just interested in the response body. And because we use the same model when we were just doing the demo a minute ago, the model will be the same. So we don't need to change this code here. This will just work because it has a data field. Okay, so now when we submit this again, nothing seems to have changed, but of course we know that, actually let me not send anything here and do it again. You see, this content came from this HTTP request and then we echoed it back. Well, more or less, because we are modifying the result model here a little bit. All right, so we also improved communication and composition between parent and child workflows. What I will show is the ability to create composite activities using the designer by creating workflow definitions. So what we can do is create a workflow definition, design a reusable bit of logic, mark it as reusable or as an activity, and then we can use that. So I already did the demo during one of the last meetings, but it's been improved a little bit more. There's now also the ability to configure the possible outcomes. So let's take a look. Let's say we create a simple sum operation. It's the same demo I gave last time, but I don't exactly recall if we implemented input and output at that point, but this one is certainly new, which is outcomes, which allows you to say positive or negative, for example, and then we'll just rename this to determine. That's not a correct word in this context, but by lack of a better word, we'll use it like this. This is the activity name. Of course, we are creating a workflow definition, but by setting usable as activity to yes, it will be usable as an activity. And then this name will be used for that activity type. You can say provide some description, returns positive if the value is greater than 0. Let's do it like this. So we'll add another outcome called neutral if it's 0. All right, so these are the outcomes, but of course we need some input. We need some value, some number to determine whether it's positive value, negative value, or a neutral value. So we'll add a value of type int, and we'll call this, this will be the display name as presented to the user that's using this composite activity. So we'll call this value. So here we have an input. We can provide an output, but in this case, I will just demo the outcomes. Actually, let's do both. So we'll also provide some textual representation of the positivity. So we'll say positivity of type string. Okay, so this is basically the interface, the function signature, if you will, if you think of this workflow as a function. But now comes the implementation, and for that we will maybe use a JavaScript, or actually let's use a switch. A switch sounds perfect. All right, so we use this flow switch, and then we have 3 cases, and the first one is called positive, and it's positive if the input, the get value greater than 0, negative if get value less than 0, and neutral.
But this is the same. A flow switch is like a switch, but switch has the done. The done, that's right. Okay, default and flow switch. Okay, like we have seen.
Exactly. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. As you can see, indeed here, these are embedded ports and these are external ports.
Yeah.
Okay. So good. So now we have handled this input and we can return the positivity. But the question is now, how do we provide the output here? And also, how do we communicate the outcome? And for that, we have, I think, complete. Yeah, so using the complete activity, we can control the outcome of the current scope or the current workflow. So here we'll say for positive, we'll return the positive outcome. So this list is fed from the outcomes here. So we'll connect these two. And then the same goes for, actually, let's give this a name, positive, negative, and neutral. Okay, so that handles sending back the outcomes. And the question is, how do we provide the output? And that's this one here, set workflow output. And we can either basically repeat the logic here as to set the value. So here we can set the output to positive. So that's directly bound to here. And the value could be basically a copy of what we implemented here, which is the easiest in this example, I think. But of course, you could also add a set workflow output in each branch and do it this way. But to keep the flow, well, I want to say to keep the flow simple, that's actually not going to be simple, because what do I connect to here? It would work if we were using this switch here with the cases, completing the workflows and then setting the workflow output. But now that I see this, it's going to be easier to just do it like this.
There is no order importance in setting the output and then complete the workflow? We can complete before setting the workflow output?
That's a good question. Let me check the implementation, because I know the finish one will cancel out every subsequent scheduled activity, so that would not work. But I wonder if we're complete, if it does something.
Can't we set the output before the switch?
Yes, actually, that's clever. Yeah, of course. We set first the output, then do the switch on the output here. We could, it doesn't provide some output, but you're right, of course. Yes, and we could even store the actual positivity in a variable. Then we use that variable to set the output and also switch on the variable here if we needed to. Yeah, because, well, actually, then we don't even need this flow switch, because then we can just switch to JavaScript and return the outcome here. That's the easiest flow. So I like that. Let's keep it simple. So let's create a variable called.
And could we do this with only one activity with only JavaScript?
Yes, that's even simpler. You can just do JavaScript. Actually, I think we would be missing. We can set the output. That's okay. But then this JavaScript would have to return the output. But then there's no way to set the outcome. So we would either need another JavaScript and then a function to set it. And I've seen in, for example, Orchard, there they have also a JavaScript activity, and it has a function called set outcome, I believe. And then you can also specify the list of possible outcomes, and then they appear as ports here. So that's another, could be either a separate activity or an enhancement to run JavaScript. But yeah, but that works too in part. But for now, let's do it like this. The positivity. And notice that I'm not using positivity as which would conflict with the output name here potentially. I haven't tested it, so I don't want to accidentally cause some weird behavior. I do need to test this before long, but for now, just to be safe, I will just call it the positivity, and it will be a string. Of course, object will work because an object can be anything, but in this case, I like to be specific. So we have a variable to positivity, then we need to set that value using that variable. Okay, so here we have a string to positivity, that's this one. Then we will connect it to setting the output positivity, and the output will be get the positivity like so. Now we handled setting this. And then finally, we just need one set outcome. Outcome would be a JavaScript expression, get the positivity. So just as this one. All right, so good thinking, Mohammed. That's much easier. All right, so now that we publish this one, we have a new category called workflows, which contains this activity here. So we can use this now as an activity. So if we go back to the workflow here, we can add it here. So here we see the outcomes, positive, negative, neutral. Here we can provide a value. So we could say, let's make it parameterizable. So let's say we start this workflow from an HTTP endpoint, and we'll create a new variable called the arg. So that with this will be contain a let's say it's a dynamic object, and it will contain the value as a field on the JSON, and we'll capture it here as the arg. Then here we'll use that as an input. So we'll say for the value, we'll use a JavaScript expression called get the arg, which will be an object containing a field called value. So here we'll be sending JSON value. We'll call this 43. Okay, and then the output we will capture using this, and this is a string. And we can also connect some logic here. So we could maybe echo back to the HTTP client. We can say positive, negative, and neutral. All right, so let's see if this works. Not found. Oh, yeah, let's make this a post. So we received an OK. We didn't get any content back, so that's an issue. Let's see if we can look at the workflow instance here. So here we have the journal. So we have the HTTP endpoint here. Post. This is not right. This should be the evaluated value. So let me double check something. JavaScript get the. Okay, looks like I broke something in the process, and this is not being evaluated. So that's unfortunate for this demo. But you can see the way it's going to work. So having the main point being able to create composite activities easily using the designer without having to do it in C#. Of course, you can still do that, but this provides a faster way and also more clear in case you do have some more complicated logic. It's easier to look at it visually than potentially in C#, and the ability to connect these outcomes. But let's see if it at least works without JavaScript. So let's imagine that we received it like this. Well, that's I should have tested this before the demo. This is too bad. Let me quickly check the backend here. And just to double check, we set the variable to get value, set the output, and we get the positivity. Then we complete here. Well, there could be a bug anywhere. Maybe if this one doesn't actually return the value, then
is it sensitive for the outcomes?
Maybe, could be neutral, negative. So the casing is correct. So that shouldn't be. Oh, that's okay. I will double check this after the call and make sure it works the next time I demo this one.
Yeah.
So let's see what's next. So this one is covered. This one is covered, although we found some issues. Ability to upgrade composite activities. So that's related to this one here. So now we have two versions. This one is published. This was version 1. Yeah. And here we have version 2. So let's imagine we make a change where we say we accept yet another input parameter. Let's call it input 2 of type object, doesn't matter. But the point is the signature has changed. We published this one. Oh, I was wondering why I didn't publish, and that's because it requires you, for now at least, as a safety guard to be on the draft, because you can't publish anything but the latest version. Of course, I will probably change it to when you click publish, it will just take the current latest one. But this was a quick fix to make sure it didn't break anything if you were looking at an older version. So switching back to the latest version here, then publishing will work. And again, so the signature has changed here. Or wait, where did my input go? I don't know what happened there. Let me try this one again. So input 2, publish. So here it's just 1, and here we have 2. Okay, so we are now at version 3. But if we go back to our workflow here. This is the composite activity. If we look at version, its current version is 1, but we have a new version published. And the reason it doesn't do this automatically is because if you change the implementation or the signature or both or either of a composite activity, then you could potentially break other workflows out there that are in production, they're running. So you don't want to risk that. So for that reason, as soon as you drag and drop a composite activity onto the canvas, it will take that version and it will be pinned to that version. So if you want to take advantage of the changes of the newest version, so here we just see one input, but now if we upgrade, we're now at the latest version, and then we can take advantage of the update here. Probably we'll add some tooling so that you can do it in bulk on maybe all workflow definitions, or maybe a selection of workflow definitions where you want to apply or upgrade the composite activities. But we'll have to think more about that. For now, it's this manual operation, which is a little bit of work, but it's the safest option for now.
I think it could be a good idea to be able to downgrade and choose a specific version. In case of bug detection, we need to roll back to a previous version. Would be good also.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Right now, you would do it by going to the composite definition here, let's say, and you say, let's say this one has a bug and this one is okay, so you can say revert. It will create a new version, but based on this one. So this is a copy of this one. You can publish this and then revert to the latest version here. But I agree, it will be good to just be able to select the version you want to use. So maybe we'll change this UI with a drop-down of the current version. So here it automatically updates to the published version, but maybe this should be a drop-down, and then you can select. So that's definitely a good suggestion.
Yeah. And what happens if a version is deleted?
I was afraid you was gonna ask, and because I don't have a good answer. But let's say we delete version 4, right? So we're just gonna try it. So I'm gonna go here, gonna revert. So we can't delete it now because it's the published version, but we published to this one, and now we should be able to delete this one. And since it didn't disappear, I suspect something in the backend didn't go well. Nothing wrong here. What about console? Yeah, so we got issues here. So this is something we need to improve and safeguard. But for now, you're more or less protected by doing something like that, and you just get an error. But the question is, what should happen if we delete a version that is used? Should we maybe prevent the user from doing so by checking to see if there's any usages?
Probably, yeah. Or downgrade a version. I don't know. It really depends which version you are deleting also. So
because I can imagine that if you delete a version, but then usages are being downgraded, that will affect all of the workflow definitions using it.
Yeah. I think at least we must show the usage. We must be able to show the usage, and then we can think about how we can work on it, because I think it's very difficult. Because if we decide to change all the workflow, we need to republish all the workflow, etc. It could be breaking something, it could be create some issue and downtime in the server. So it's a real question.
Yeah. So you're saying it should show the usages, and then the user can manually update these workflow definitions, or at least be aware of what they're about to do, and then they have to manually do whatever.
For the first step, yes. For the first steps, yes. It let us time to think about the good choice we can give to the end user.
Yeah, makes sense. So that's a thing we definitely need to improve here. But for now, as you can see, that doesn't even work. I wonder if you can delete any version in the first place. No, latest version. Oh, find filter dates to published. Okay, so this error seems to be unrelated to using these things, but some bug that got introduced. Well, thank you for the question, Mohammed, and showing that this part is still needs some work. Okay.
Yeah. It's the pain of customer behavior that makes me ask these questions. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like you've gone through things.
Yeah.
All right, but that's good. So we'll fix that. So that's the ability to upgrade composite activities. improved workflow instance journal. We already took a quick look at that. If we go to workflow instances, let me resume this first. So here we should be able to look at the, so let me refresh. Oh, wow. Looks like this entire instance is broken now. What's happening here? Okay, so that stems from the bug that now seems to have corrupted some state. So what I will do is open the database and do some cleanup. All right, refresh. All right, so let me show this following. So let's say we have two write lines. Publish this one. Take a note of definition ID. Now I'm gonna run this workflow using the execute endpoint so that this workflow executed. And now we're going to look at the workflow instance. So here we have one instance. This is the journal, so it shows the activities that they executed. And what's different now in this version is that originally it would just show the expression. Actually, now this is a poor demo because it doesn't show you the difference. Let me fix that real quick. Let's imagine this was not literal, but let's say it's a JavaScript that says return hello. Let me execute this one again. All right, so as you can see, it doesn't display the string, the JavaScript expression return hello, but the evaluated result. That's different here. So that's a good improvement. And also, as you may have noticed in one of the previous demos, even when using composite activities, even though you don't see the activities on the designer yet, we'll add that capability later, you will be able to look at the executed activities of those composite activities and inspect their values here. And what's nice, as compared to Elsa 2, this does not only show you the latest state of the activity, but you can click on the journal items here and inspect the state of the activity at that time. So if we were doing this, for example, in a loop, we should be able to see the state of the activity on a given iteration. And now I haven't tried that, but it sounds like something fun to do. So and easy as well. So let's say we have a looping construct. So we're gonna just delete this one here, delete this one for now, and then we say for 1 to 3. So this is like a C#4 loop from 1 to 3. We're gonna capture the current value in a variable like that, and then for each iteration we'll write something. So we'll say write line. My property panel doesn't want to update. Okay, so I don't know what that glitch was about, but here we have the write line, and we're gonna write the current value. So we're gonna say return, or we don't need to return necessarily. We'll just say current step, and then we'll get the current value like this, right? We executed the workflow. This is the output. Now we'll take a look at the workflow instance. So here we see the 4. Okay, so looks like there's an issue here with the, I don't know where this comes from, but the idea was for each iteration to see, well, basically see 3 write lines and then be able to click on those write lines and see it appear here, but unfortunately it's not allowing me to do so. So for now, I didn't actually know you were able to drill into it. So this is a little surprise here, but it shows the latest step here, but you will be able, once I fix this issue, be able to click on the individual iteration. And then you will see current step 2 and current step 1, depending on which one you selected. So not quite done yet, but a step in the right direction. Yeah, finally, there was some small issue fixed with the checkbox. Doesn't seem very important in light of these issues that I just encountered, but just to show you what that was about is if you use the HTTP endpoint, it has this checkbox here. If you were to not do anything but just publish, it would suddenly be checked. So that's fixed. And then finally, there was an issue with the HTTP RouteTable, which is used for routed parameters. So let's say you have an HTTP endpoint and you want a path like, let's say, users and then some user ID. Right, like in an API controller, you can provide a route parameter in the route. So here we can do that as well. That works. But there was an issue if you stop the application and start it again. The route table would not be reinitialized based on the triggers of a workflow. So that's been fixed. It also means we should be able to read this ID by capturing the route data. So that's an object dictionary. And then this will contain one entry with a key of ID, which is retrieved from this route. it will contain the value of this route. So let's say number 2, and then we should be able to make a request here. So that sounds like another fun thing to do. So we can say URL, actually switch this one to JavaScript, and then we'll do it like this. So we'll say get route params. And now I'm not sure if I am able to use dot syntax. I don't think so, since this is a dictionary and it's not an expandable object. So I'm gonna guess it's gonna be like this, ID. All right, let's see if this works. So the route was users ID. ID 2 we know exists. So workflows users 2. This is a get, so let's change this to get. And that worked. So we were able to capture this route parameter, use it in a request to the backend, or regress. 3 exists too, so we can try what we get with 3, which is a different user. All right, so that was the final one that I wanted to show. But as it's clear, it's not yet ready for prime time. There's still some small, some bigger issues to correct. So what do you guys think? Yeah, go ahead.
It looks cool. I have one question by looking at this demo. So suppose I have a workflow that needs to connect to certain API and collect the data periodically. And for this API, I need to have an access token. So I need to log in, get an access token, and then use it in the workflow. And this token maybe will expire after several hours. But I don't want to request a new token every time I execute the workflow. So is there a way to cache the token and then reuse it until it expires?
I think we need to have some activities to cache data. Get cache, insert data into cache, and this activity could also allow the user to choose what implementation you want to use, if you want to use some Redis or some other cache system.
So that would be similar to using a set variable. So the variable is like a cache, but either stored as part of the workflow, or maybe a Redis storage, or as you suggest, maybe there should be a cache activity. That could make sense. It could make sense to store stuff in the cache, and then you can request this access token, store it in cache, use it, but you would have to do some logic, right, to check to see if the cache value is still there, or maybe even handle the 401 response from your initial HTTP or your HTTP request. You could, for example, use this thing here to make your API call, and initially if there's no token, it will respond with a 401. So you basically would expect 200 and 401. So what you could do in the 401 branch, you would say authenticate. Let's say this is authenticate, and then you can just try again. So because here authenticate will, in the output, you will capture the response here, HTTP response, which will carry the access token, or maybe as part of a JSON object, you would set it to some cache value maybe, or a variable. Let's keep it simple for now and use a variable access token. So this would be like, let's use data. Let's imagine this is just the entire payload, and it has a field called access token, sorry. And then here we have set variable, where you say access token equals get user data dot access token, for example. So here we have store access token, and then we can try the request again. We can go back here, and this time, ideally, this of course will include your access token in the settings here in the authorization. The access token like so. And what's nice here is because of this automatic loop, you don't have to do anything else. You can now just continue on to whatever else you need to do.
Yeah, and if we have some cache mechanism, we can just encapsulate this into a composite workflow, get the access token. If it is found, we check the date time, etc. And if it's not found, or if it is the date time is incorrect, we can get a new access token and add it into the cache.
That's a very good point. You can. That's a beautiful use case for composite activities created in Designer. Implementing that logic, and then you can reuse it as a high-level component in your overall workflow. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, it sounds good.
Great. Then that's all I have. I'll be working on those issues. We get closer to potential release candidate material every day now. So realistically, hopefully a month from now, we can do a release candidate with a stable version.
Good.
Yeah, pretty excited about that. All right, then thank you guys for attending, and I'll see you next time.
Yes, thank you. Bye. Have a good week.
Thank you very much. Yeah, have a good day.